Okay, guys, so this week's teaching, we're going to be looking at Halah, Habor, and the river Gozan, and this issue of the 10 tribes, and we're going to try and understand where they were dispersed to. We saw last week that there was a fulfillment of the destiny of Israel, that Israel was called out of Egypt, and to Pharaoh it was said, Israel is my firstborn, and part of the firstborn privilege of the nation was that they would have the meeting place. We see that in the end days, nations will go up to Zion. They would have this political dominance. We see Messiah, a son of David, he will have that among the nations. Religious dominance. We see the Levites, the priests, Melchizedek priesthood as well, also happening in Jerusalem, with nations learning the Torah from Jerusalem, and so we've been learning about Israel's place in the nations. But another part is that they would get a double portion, and so we see the nation. This is what happened. Israel came into, with time, became represented in two parts. In the north, we had the 10 tribes, with kings predominantly from the descendants of Joseph, a very shaky kingdom, a very rebellious kingdom. It never went well. Joseph separated from Judah. Just seems like things go down really quickly. We see assimilation, Baal worship, we see religious creativity, and and even though the Jewish people in the south, the house of Judah, Yehudah, they weren't perfect in everything, they certainly didn't go to the lengths as the northern kingdom in terms of backsliding. And so we saw that there came a point, we read last week with the prophet Hosea. Hosea came and said, the Lord says this to you, a house of Israel, northern kingdom, house of Joseph. He says, you're Jezreel, I'm going to scatter you. You are lo ami, lo ruhama. I'm not going to have mercy on you anymore. My patience is up. Lo ami, you are not my people. He severed that covenant relationship. And in Jeremiah chapter 3, we read that he issued those 10 tribes a bill of divorce. And so they were the first ones to be taken into captivity for their punishments. And this happened in 722 BC, roughly. And it happened in a series of waves. And where they went, well, they went into what is known as the Neo-Assyrian Empire. And it was a dominant empire, and it was building, and it was getting greater and greater. Before that, actually, the northern kingdom was doing really well. It was successful in many ways, but it was slowly getting weaker and weaker and weaker. And then eventually, they were taken off into captivity. Assyria got great. And so we can read in the scriptures about what happened to Israel, and where they were deported, especially these 10 tribes. So what we see is that in the book of Kings and in Chronicles is that they were deported. All right, they were taken out. There may have been a remnant that managed to flee to caves or fled down to Judah, but this would have been a minority of minorities. They may be mentioned, but the general description of the scriptures is that they were taken and led out of Israel. And the description given in the scriptures is that they went to Halah, Habor, and the river Gozan, and the cities of the Medes. We're going to see what does this mean, and try and understand where they went to. Now you'll see in the map that I've got up here, you'll see where the kingdom was. You'll see Jerusalem south of the northern kingdom. Remember, Jerusalem was in Benjamin, which was allied to Judah in the south. So basically in that red block there, that's where the house of Israel was. And it was from there that they were taken. And so we're going to look at where they went. Now, there are a few things I want you to learn about the Assyrian Empire and how they thought. And this goes with many empires in general. So it was Tiglath-Pileser that really revolutionized the Assyrian empire. It was waning a bit for a while, and he came in and he really took charge and started doing well. Um, and and a number one thing that the Assyrians were very conscious of was they were very conscious of the trade routes, mainly between the Mediterranean and the Iranian plateau. There was an area called the Fertile Crescent. Let me go back. Well, let me find a picture that I can show you there. So you'll see here the Mediterranean Sea going through to the Medes or the Iranians here, and this was a fertile area. It was a trade route across here and then down into Egypt, and that's what was known as, so you have Egypt down here, this is what is also known as the Fertile Crescent. And they didn't really bother too much with the Arabia here and desert and whatever. They really focused on the trade routes, and so that's the first thing just to be aware of. The second thing that they were conscious of is, and Tiglath-Pileser III in particular, is he valued the value of an area over the value of occupying an area. So he would weigh it up. There was no point sending huge troops to conquer lands that are just mountainous, mountain kingdoms. For what gain? Perhaps, yes, to close off a territory, to close off a trade route, but they were selective in that. Why devote all your armies to things that are not important? They didn't mind giving autonomy. They could have crushed people, but they played their cards very carefully, and they were very strategic in this empire. Third thing to be aware of the traits of the Neo-Assyrians is they were very strategic in deportations, and this was just a very tragic thing about this empire, is that they were known to just destroy nations and wreck them, uproot them. They literally, if the image of a plant, and just uprooted them and moved them elsewhere. This is what they did. For instance, when the 10 tribes were taken away, and there's in stages, they were replaced, and we get in Kings who they were replaced by. They were replaced by Kuthians and other people on the other side of the empire, placed in Samaria, the former capital, and they became what today and in Yeshua's day were known as the Samaritans. All right. Now, even though the Samaritans occupy the ex-territories of the 10 tribes, they are not descendants of the 10 tribes. Okay. It's part of the tragedy of people being transplanted and pulled out and taken and planted somewhere else. And that's what the Assyrians did wonderfully. And it was a way in which they could control peoples. And we're going to get more into that as well, how it could be strategically advantageous. And number 4 was he thought in terms of provinces and nations. Okay, this is important because when Israel is described as going to Halah, Habor, the river Gozan, the cities of the Medes, these are not phrases for the same geographical area. Okay, and we'll get into why some people think that it might be a way of describing that. No, in the Assyrian Empire, when it's describing, they were taken to here, there, and there. These are nations that they have managed to conquer. And we're dealing with almost, at least I would say, 2 million Israelites that need to go somewhere. So this is more provincial. They were provinces. These were large areas. They were conquering lands, and it was a huge empire. So these are important things from the beginning. I've had to wade through a lot of material and decide this is how they looked at it, and this is how we should understand their strategic thinking in terms of plucking out nations and where they put them and why, and it's got to do with trade and control and dominance. So in my research, I've spent a lot of time trying to understand just where the tribes were put, because we kind of need that to get to further conclusions about where they went. But we can, as I've been going through it, I've been genuinely, it took me a while to come across it, but impressed with the work that Sir Isaac Newton did. I didn't even realize that this man did this kind of stuff, but he was obviously a genius, and I think he developed calculus during the Black Death. I mean, he was just a clever guy. Anyway, but he also had a hand at what is called revised, where he tried to revise biblical history, or take what came through and trying to filter it through and make sense of the complexity of some of these things concerning biblical history. So I've got a picture of him here. And what I really liked about his approach is that firstly, he has a kingdom provincial approach to the places of dispersion. He sees Israel as not, this northern kingdom as not some small little nation. Oh, there are a few little people that Assyria plucked out. No, they were a proper nation. They were numerous, and they were taken out and they were deported. And so he sees the listing of places in his mind, and knowing how the Assyrians talked, they were being taken to areas that were significant within the Neo-Assyrian Empire. So that's the first thing. He's got a bigger view of what Israel had become and a bigger view of how they were settled. Number two, he sticks to a plain reading of the original Hebrew text. I appreciate this. Very often when we don't get things as we want, or we battle to understand a few passages, then we start saying, well, there must be a scribal error, or this must be a textual problem, or whatever, where that should be our last goal. Rather, we should look at, try and understand and wrestle with it more before we just say, okay, this must be a scribal issue, or we try and reconcile it through whatever means it must be. And he's very strong on trying to understand, okay, the original Hebrew says this, what could it be meaning? And then the third one, the positions he came up with that I was also lending towards, they make sense in terms of how Assyria was thinking and why they would take Israel and put them in certain areas, and so it just makes a lot of sense. And I think as we go through this, it's gonna seem right in terms of understanding. Okay, this is where these 10 tribes were deported in various waves leading up to 722 BC. Okay, so let's have a look at this area. You'll see the Mediterranean Sea. You will see the Fertile Crescent. The red dot that I put there, that is the capital of Assyria. You'll see Ashur next to it. That's where the Assyrians had that was their nation there, and they had managed to, that whole green area eventually they managed to take. And I've also got some other arrows there. They really tried to dominate the different rival nations, especially that trade route. You can see how they dominated that Fertile Crescent area. And in the north they had the kingdom of Urartu, and they also worked very hard to stop them from trading with the Medes. You'll see there's a green block I put on the side there. We'll get to that in a while, which was to block out a trade going through there, and those wild areas out to the east, further east, but to basically control the trade. And so it became a massive kingdom, brutal in many ways, ruthless. So it was in this situation that the house of Israel was deported. So we're going to look at at where they were taken. Now it makes sense from just looking at where the house of Israel was on the coast here, that if they were taken out, they would have tried to put them in the northeast part of the empire. They don't want them close enough to get home, maybe in the north or something like that, or here, but certainly it would not make sense to try and put them in the middle of there or within striking distance to home. But we're going to look at what did these words mean, and so we'll read through some of the passages that speak about Israel's deportation and what the scriptures say about where they ended up. All right, in 1 Chronicles chapter 5 verse 26, we read, this is about the first taking of exiles that were east of the Jordan, Reuben, Gad, and the half tribe of Manasseh. It says, so the God of Israel stirred up the spirit of Pul, king of Assyria, the spirit of Tiglath-Pileser, king of Assyria, and he took them into exile, namely the Reubenites, Gadites, and the half tribe of Manasseh. And here we get the description of where they went to. Halah, Habor, Halah, and the river Gozan to this day. Okay, so when later on the scribe was writing, he was saying even to this day, so there was a while before they moved on, but they stayed there, and this was their new lot in life. They had to embrace these new places and try and survive. Now, first off, well, let's first read all three different descriptions. You also get in 2 Kings chapter 17 verse 6. In the 9th year of Hosea, the king of Assyria captured Samaria. Okay, so this was later. Got to Samaria, north of Jerusalem. And he carried off the Israelites away to Assyria and placed them. Okay, so this is years later. I think it was about 15 years later after the first deportation, but we get the list of the similar kind of places: Halah, Habor, the river Gozan, and in the cities of the Medes. Okay, 2 Kings 18:11. The kings of Assyria carried the Israelites away to Assyria and put them in Halah and in Habor, the river Gozan, and in the cities of the Medes. So we have these three descriptions of deportation, and we see a lot of commonalities in terms of the descriptions. But let's first look at what's a bit different. The first thing that is quite interesting as I was trying to study through these different names is in the 1 Chronicles description, we have this added Hebrew word, hara. Okay? And there's a question mark of this added bit of hara, because usually it's Halah, Habor, and the river Gozan, but we have this hara here, and the understanding of what does this mean. And some people say, well, it sounds a lot like Haran. You remember the Israelites were taken up, they came from Haran. Abraham came down from Haran. So people say, well, it's kind of close to Haran, maybe it's Haran. But the Hebrew reads hara, and the scribes will keep writing it as hara. That's how it is today. So that's something that needs to be looked at. The other thing is this issue of the river Gozan. The plain reading, it reads as though it is a river called Gozan. But we also see in Isaiah, in a passage, Isaiah 37 verse 12, where an Assyrian king is boasting about his destruction of certain nations and describes Gozan as a nation in and of itself. So the river Gozan is most probably somehow tied to a territory, a province known as Gozan, most likely. And what else? I'm trying to think. We'll see what comes up, but that's what we have for now. So let's start with the first one. Let's start with Halah, and I'm going to be drawing on Newton and other scholars, but I'm going to go towards Newton's ideas of understanding of where the tribes were taken. So Halah, we read in 2 Kings 17 verse 6, there we see this was one of the destinations. Where is this Halah? And we should understand that it was a province within Assyria, that we should find in the text, whether it's Diodorus or Herodotus or whoever, there should be some remnants of something describing a Halah province in Assyria, and there is. I've put this, found this out there, and it seems in Hebrew a ha can also be a ch sound, and there was a province called Halah or Helachin. The Assyrians would add e, or later generations would add that in, but it was this idea of Halach. And we see this with Kalachin, and we see the description of it in the north. We get this description of the mountains of Armenia there, and Arapachitis. Okay, Newton, he disputes this, and rightly so. It doesn't quite make sense, but anyway, on the west there's the Tigris, and on the east there would be the Lycus. Had to spend so much time trying to figure out what the Lycus was. That's what's known today as the Great Zab River. And south by the province, a territory in and of itself, another province called Abiadin to the south. But the Israelites weren't taken to Abiadin, they were taken north of Abiadin to Halach. And then it goes through some of these the cities there. So and here we see this commentator here understands that this is the area where the king of Assyria would have placed captive Israelites, to which I agree as well. And built by, yes, and so we can go to the next slide where we can have a look at this area. So in the north, sorry about that. So in the north of Assyria, we see here's the areas they started conquering towards the north, and they would go up into the north. You remember Urartu was there, and to the east there was the Medians there, and so in the north area we find that there is this place that was known as Kalachin province, with Halah, the capital city. And so this would have been the first place that Israelites were sent. And it's here that we can begin to see a bit of the strategy that went on here, why they would do this. They don't just want to uproot them, they want to place them in places that are advantageous to the Assyrian Empire. And they were trying to most likely create a buffer zone between Urartu in the north and themselves here. And so they would place them in these Gordian mountains along here. And in these territories, they most probably didn't want to hold on to them. They didn't have any trade value to them. But they were these buffer zones, and they're mountainous and whatever. So most probably this is where they put a lot of the Israelites. This would have been the first place here. And we see it's the exact description. The Tigris comes up, and it goes on the west. And the Great Zab is here to the east and south. This is exactly where Abiadin is. So it all lines up. I think we can be quite confident that this is the original area where part of the Israelites were sent to. All right. So that does Halah. And then the next place that they were taken to is Habor. And so we read in 1 Chronicles about how they were taken to not just Halah but Habor. Which province was this? What area was this? What should we expect? We should expect perhaps not the best of lands. We should expect be again of strategic value, and we should be thinking of those things. And so we can read, this is Isaac Newton. He describes it quite well there, having gone through all the different manuscripts. On the northeast of Assyria, so Halah was more to the north, but he's saying on the northeast, were Habor or Haborus mountain region between Assyria and Media. Okay, so this makes sense again. A buffer zone between enemies. The Assyrians have made enemies of everyone, so it makes sense. Put some people in between, so if any wars come out, they can be cannon fodder. And what else do we see? So there's a Haborus region between Assyria and Media. So this is on the northeast side. This is where Isaac Newton understood this. And at the base of it, the Apharsachites, or men of Arapaghitis, a region placed by Ptolemy, at the bottom of that mountain region next to Assyria. So we're getting some good description here. And so we can actually go to the map and we can see where this region was. It also makes quite easy sense, I think, anyway. And here we see, so in the north here, we had the Tigris up here and the Great Zab heading off here. So in this region here was the one group, the Halah, we've looked at that. Abiadin to the south. And it is here the description we have of between Assyria and Media. Okay, a mountainous region. Okay, that's this strip, and at the base of it were the Arapaghites. Okay, this was Abiadin, and below that was Arafah, and so it makes sense that this is the mountainous region that's being referred to. Now, what is interesting is that Isaac Newton actually makes use of the Hebrew here in, I think, the right way. You remember I said there's a discrepancy over what we make of Hara. Hara is just mentioned there. It's not mentioned any of the other times, but in that first description, we have it here. Habor Hara. You'll see here in Smith's dictionary of the Bible, it can also mean a mountain land. Har is a mountain in Hebrew. So the idea was Habor Hara, the Haborus mountain land. That's why Newton gives it this description here of a Haborus, a mountainous region. And so that makes sense again. Taken out, put on the a buffer zone between them, in the mountains. This is today where the Kurds live. I mean, this is like Afghanistan, back hills of, it's tough territory, and not of huge value, except, well, as a good buffer. So we can start seeing the mind of Assyria in why they're placing them in these different lands. Right, so that's Habor, and I'm just going to also show you another picture that highlights where it was. So between Assyria, so this was the Arapaghitis area at the base of these mountains here. You can see it looks mountainous on this picture here, and at the base, so this was it stretched here, mountainous region between the Media and Assyria. This is what is understood, or Ptolemy described as the Haborus mountain region. So a province in and of itself, and deported here as well. While we're on this picture, it's also interesting is that you can see a weak spot in the empire is, let me get this one again, is in the north we have Urartu, and they can kind of trade around the top end, right? And they can get through to Media. So even while the Assyrian Empire has enlarged itself, this kind of zone here, there could still be lots of trading happening. And so we're going to see actually this also comes in now when we try and understand Gozan and what the Assyrian Empire was trying to do with the last description of where Israel was taken, or the second to last. So there's this Lake Urmia, and these are powerful trade routes that went down through here. And so the Haborus was this nice protection between Assyria and Media, and yet there was still this area here that Assyria would want to try and control, and we're going to get to that now. Okay. So here we see the two regions that I believe are described in the scriptures: Halah or Kalchin, and then the Haborus mountain region, Halah and Habor in Kings. Those two squares there, and as we see on the outside, on the border, and yeah, it makes sense when we start understanding their tactics. Okay, a little bit like, strategic deportations, a bit like Australia, where you could settle people in places that long term this would be advantageous to us, and they would have to make a go of it and make it work. Also, this seems to be the case here, except there would have been a lot of hatred with Israel. Okay, the final one of Gozan. This one seems, you can even look at this picture here. You can look for Gozan on the picture. This one seems to be the most easily understood because there is a town called Gozan. And this is what leads to a lot of confusion in this topic, because we jump to, there's a Gozan, that must be Gozan, because we're just trying to find any name that can line up. And just trying to line up the scriptures, so we're just so grateful. We see, Gozan, great, they went there. And even also the province was called Gozan as well, which also just makes it, this must be Gozan. However, we shouldn't be so quick to think that this Gozan in Syria, not far from Nineveh, is where this last description of Israel being taken to. And maybe you might think of, that's why in the beginning I went through reasons why Assyria was doing certain things, what they liked, what they wanted to protect, and it just doesn't make sense on some levels, which we'll get into, if this is the Gozan that Israel was taken to. All right. What also what makes a lot of scholars also say, wow, this must be the area, because there's a river there called the Habor. And so now we've got Gozan and we've got Habor, and it's close to Haran. So that Harar could be Haran. And so we got a lot of these things together, and so they were most probably settled in this region here, and so a lot of scholars go down that way of thinking. But there are a few things that just don't line up to think of that. All right, yeah, and then so let's have a look. And some of the translations, they don't stick to the Hebrew because they want this Gozan and Harar, and there's a Habor river that's a tributary of the Euphrates, and it looks like they try and because it doesn't make sense of, it speaks about the river Gozan. Okay, the river here isn't called Gozan, so they try and make it, there's a river in Gozan. And you'll see this in a few of translations. 2 Kings 17:16. I don't know what your Bibles read as. Place them in Halah. So it was in Halah and in Habor, not on the Habor. Some translations will try and say on the Habor to make it sound like the Habor, that Habor river. Where we sing no, in Habor makes sense in terms of the Haborus mountain region, and it makes more sense in terms of where it's positioned. And the river goes in, they try and say the river of Gozan. But the way the Hebrew reads, it reads more like the river, and we saw Gozan was mentioned in Isaiah as well, that the province, and there was a dominant river that's known as the river Gozan as well, in the cities of the Medes. So you get these translations out there, and I think it's trying to just help us make sense of this. But I see a few reasons why this doesn't work, and just in terms of how the Assyrians thought and how the empire worked. Okay, let's have a look. Okay, remember I said this is the Fertile Crescent. This is some of the best lands. This is where Babylon, Assyria, the Medes, if you're going to have an empire, you needed to control, this is the area of the Euphrates and the Tigris rivers. Some of the best lands. You want to control it. You don't want your enemies to control it. So the idea of them placing Israelites, who would have hated them now, in some of the best lands around Gozan just don't make sense. The idea of them being placed in far-flung areas and mountainous areas or border areas makes a lot more sense. So the Fertile Crescent, also it's close to Haran. We've discussed how Israel had family connections in a way with Haran, and the descendants of Eber, a few of them lived in Haran, and they most probably were a fair amount now. So it wouldn't have made sense to, there would have been that familial commonality, and that also wouldn't have made sense to put them so close, because they would be strengthened by that. Also, it's not far from the Euphrates to get home. Okay, there's a bit of distance. But at the same time, they haven't conquered Judah. They would have been fearful of some reunification that could have happened in Israel somehow. So they would have tried to deport them much further across the empire with no quick way of maybe getting home or anything like that. Also, what seems to be an issue is the boasting. It would seem the Neo-Assyrian Empire conquered lands like you can't believe. For them to say you've been taken to Gozan, Habor, Halah, and it's all kind of in the same region, it just falls short. It's like it's not a great boast. If you're going to boast of I conquered this kingdom and that kingdom and whatever, not like I settled you on the river that goes through Gozan province and speaking of in the same way of the same kind of territory. So with Gozan, it would seem, and again, Newton has a bigger vision. He sees no, Israel was not going to get the best spot in Assyria. The Assyrians were not going to treat them nicely. They were going to put them in places where they had to fight to stay alive, buffer zone, that kind of idea. And so we need to look somewhere else. It just doesn't make sense. So this is the first idea of the Gozan. There is a Gozan, and it is a province, and there's this Haborus river. But as we've seen, it shouldn't be a river. It's about the mountain kingdom. But anyway, they're trying to find commonalities. But here we do see, later on in this quote, it says, there is also a district in Media. Okay, so up in the northeast again. So it's another northeastern position, which makes more sense, between Assyria and Media. And we also get cities of the Medes, so it was definitely on the northeast, this buffer with Media. We see another Gozan, and there's a description of it being between the Cyrus and the Cambyses, and there were I think there were 3 different Cyruses and 2 different Cambyses, and anyway. But what we do see is that there's another one around Media, and so we're going to have a look at this. And Newton describes this Gozan, I believe, better when he describes them. And beyond these, so he's talking about Halah and the Haborus region. He says, and beyond these, even further out. So it already looks like they are already, on the far end of the Neo-Assyrian Empire. It says even further beyond this, towards the Caspian Sea. We're going to have a look at this. There was the Gozan called Gozania by Ptolemy, and he understood that this is the Gozan of Scripture, which I have to concur with. And so where is this? Okay, so we're going to look for further beyond. So here's Halah, first group set here, and there's another set here in the Haborus, and it says even beyond these, this is Media to the east and to the west of Assyria. So, and here's the Caspian Sea, so we're getting some idea where we can start placing it between the Cyrus and the Cambyses. So we're looking in this block here, and we see Assyria did conquer more, even out this way, a bit more east, And so we should understand Gozan was out here even further to the east between these and the Caspian Sea. So, and we do see this in some other writings. This about Ptolemy, he speaks about this, the Caspian Sea, a city and a country called Gozania. So here we see a lot being named after it. There's also a city like Gozania, and then there's a river of the same name. Okay, so this also makes sense because it says, and the river Gozan. So Ptolemy says, see, that's what the other Gozan didn't have, is that the Hebrew reads as though the name of the river is also Gozan, that it's a province called Gozan. In Isaiah we see that, and there's a river called Gozan. And so it would seem that Israel was flung this far out, even getting towards the Caspian Sea. This was wild area out here, so I doubt it would have gone this far. And you can see even Assyria, we see they captured just this yellow strip here. And we're going to see this is exactly where Gozan is. All right, and so here you can see I've actually highlighted it. You can see this purple part, and I've put this block around it, and you can see at the top it says Gozan. And I was so delighted when I finally came across this map that describes this province, this area here. And there was a city called Gaza, and I think the river there's a river in the north, quite a big river. I think that's what was called the river Gozan. And I think the way in which it's written, about they went from here to here, and the river Gozan is like Israel may be described from Beersheba to Tel Dan to the river Euphrates. I think it's referring to the border of Assyria, the absolute end part of Assyria, which makes sense in terms of this final outpost up here in the north. But anyway, we see up here we can really understand the Assyrian attempt to place Israel. Israel was in the southwestern part of the empire, and they've uprooted them. They took them right across to the northeastern part of the empire, far away from home. There's no way they're going to come through. They've got to pass all the way through the whole of the Assyrian empire to get home. They're completely defeated and at the mercy of between big powers, Urartu in the north, the Medes in the east, and they've been placed on mountainous areas. Most probably Gozan is the nicer of the places. But given this, because there was a buffer again between Media and Urartu this time, but it would also, this is where the trade routes came through around Lake Urmia. That's why they stuck this bit again. It's about trade routes, trying to control. So they put Israel there saying, you need to be faithful to our empire. If not, we're going to take you out, and you need to remain loyal to us. And they would try to control them that way. And so this makes sense. It all starts to make sense. Okay. Let's see. Now with the description of the last two deportations of Israelites, it speaks about this added thing and the cities of the Medes. Isaac Newton there's just no description in this. The Medes had quite a big territory, so it's most probably a general term to refer to lands taken from the Medes, and they were trying to populate Israel into this northeastern part. And I think that's just a general description of that. So we're looking at this area just to look at it again, of up here, mountainous area, I believe in the north, first Halah province. And then there was the Habor here, and this Gozan with a river. And then as Assyria may have taken more land from the Medes, perhaps Israel was also coming in and settling some of these lands. All right. And we see that during the time they worked with the Assyrian Empire. They didn't just, there were no wars against them. I suppose they couldn't. They had to try and do their best. because we see that later waves, Assyria took their kindred, their brothers and sisters to those same regions. They kept repopulating them more and more, and so they were quite loyal for a while. I see there was no real way to return. All right. I also think they wouldn't have wanted to return, and this is perhaps some might think it's a bit conspiratorial, but I have found one research paper that has suggested this, and you can read in the scriptures there's almost two lines of thought of what happened with the deportation of Israel. And originally the house of Judah, the Jewish people in the south, they weren't loyal to the Assyrian Empire, but the Assyrian Empire had this policy of, if you are paying tribute and you are under us and you have issues with other nations, they had the responsibility to come and fight your wars for you in a way. And it seems as though, and I've heard a couple of people say this, that Judah may have even paid the tribute to get their brother out, because Judah and Israel were warring enough between themselves, and so it could have been a backhanded political way of getting the 10 tribes out in the north. It fits the narrative a bit with regards to Joseph being sold by Judah, or Judah putting forth the plan that the brothers act on and selling off Joseph. So it wouldn't surprise me. Well, there was definite clever politics that happened. So I don't think the 10 tribes were in any hurry to get back to the Jews. It's amazing that in time Jews even will think that the northern tribes wanted to be with them. There was such animosity and hatred for each other. It just wasn't happening. So at the end of it all 10 tribes were actually close together again. Okay, they were scattered, taken out, but they were put in a block where they at least had each other, and were with each other again, which is quite interesting. And we should see that they were not prepared to die for the Assyrian army. They had just removed them from their house, from their home in their land. They most probably just went along with the empire as far as they needed to, but we wouldn't expect much loyalty there. And what's important is that they were bordered by uncivilized lands. There were wild lands all around, and we've spoken about this before, where Israel loves farming and shepherding and ranching and animals and sheep and cows and the whole thing. It's kind of what Israel does best. I mean, we saw when Jacob went up to Laban, he just had a natural affinity for that, especially it's with livestock. Again, down in Egypt, when they were in Goshen, the Egyptians gave them the best land, and they managed to be really successful there, and multiplied, and again it was through this issue of farming and that. So the Israel's placed kind of in the back hills in the middle of nowhere, but on their doorstep there is opportunity, okay? And we're going to explore that next week, where we're going to look at what did Israel do, how did they shake the yoke of slavery and move forward, and especially in this area of cattle and ranching and what they did. So anyway, so that's quite interesting. Let me just show that picture again of where they ended up. Where is it? So let's see if it's this one. Not really. Anyway, in this one you'll see I've put here, see the Caspian Sea here. This was wild, and we've got these areas up here, and this wasn't bad. It just wasn't civilized. So, and they're in this weird mix between Urartu and Media and Syria. They most probably could just start trading again themselves and be middlemen. Who knows what happened? So the next question is, who did they become known as after this? And I'm not going to spend a lot of time. I'm going to focus more on it next week, guys. So we've established today this idea of them being on the northeast part of the Assyrian Empire, and we're going to look at what became of them. But just to say that it is around this time that Israel is deported into these three areas and possibly the cities of the Medes, that we see the emergence in these kind of uncivilized areas and the arise of new people and new people groups, one called the Sumerians and another called the Scythians. And so we're going to we'll spend some more time in why these two groups most probably represent the 10 tribes in their exile. And I know it sounds strange, but that's the problem, is that the names change. It's like Joseph being called Zaphnath Paaneah. It's like, it seems strange, but if that's what happened to him, and this seems to be what happened to Israel, is that they must have become peoples, and we should be looking in this region and saying, okay, well, where are new peoples cropping up? And then the next question will be, do they fulfill the curses put on Israel? Do they fulfill Hebraic elements? Not all of them, because we see they wouldn't care for the law. They'd eat unclean things, and they had no regard for the feast. But most probably in terms of economy and shepherding and cattle raising and that side of things, we start seeing these two nations crop up, and we're going to get into that a lot more next week. And yeah, I think we can leave it there. So this is again getting more of a history lesson, that we understand what happened. But what is important is that we understand that there was no restoration with the tribes deported into these areas, okay, to their brothers Judah. Even when Judah went to Babylon, yes, Babylon was to the south. We see it here, Babylon, Kuta. Okay, this is where the Samaritans, by the way, this is the region they came from. The Assyrians took them out of here and took them to the furthest part of the empire. That's why they put them there, in Samaria. And the tribes did not come down, and because some people are saying that there was a restoration of Israel that happened in the past. There is no speech of that. When the Jews went, let me see if I can lift this up a bit. Let me just see. Okay, when the Jews came out, you can just see my arrow down the south. Here's Judah. They were banished across to Babylon. They did eventually leave. They did eventually leave, and they were allowed to return back to Judah. Okay, but the description in Ezra and Nehemiah is that the description of those who returned were of the tribe of Judah, the tribe of Benjamin, and the tribe of Levi. You are not getting mentions of other tribes. There may have been small remnants. There may have been exceptions to the rule, but that's all there would have been, is exceptions to the rule. The bulk of the 10 tribes went north. That's the description of the scriptures, and it happened in successive waves. And so we'll look at it next week in terms of the Scythians and what happened with them. And yeah, I think we can leave it there. So today's more of a history lesson, but this is also going to be important, that we understand that in despair there is a hope. And often our Heavenly Father works through this, like when Jacob went down to Egypt. You would think, shucks, well, what's going to happen there? He's in exile, he's not in Canaan. Well, actually, it went really well for them. For Israel to become great, it would seem as though this northern kingdom, let's remember the prophecies, Ephraim will become a company of nations, plural. Manasseh, a great nation. There's 10 other tribes that are with them as well, who will most probably get their own nationhood. But the way to achieve this is they've been taken out of the land and put in the north. And we're going to see, well, what did they do, and what does history tell us about that? And so next week we will get into Josephus. Josephus is the last, I think, credible historian that gives a description of what happened to those 10 tribes, and we'll build on that in terms of trying to understand who they represented. So this deportation, this happens this is 700 BC. Josephus talks in the 1st century, in the time of Yeshua, and he makes a mention of the 10 tribes he describes them as beyond the Euphrates till this day. They are not with the Jews. He says they're still beyond the Euphrates, and we will see the descriptions he gives them where we see our Father is... The world may have forgotten the plan, and Joseph is considered dead, but our Father has been continuing with his program, whether we're aware of it or not. And so we'll get into this issue of the Scythians and the Sumerians next week. And so there's no reading that you guys need to do. And let's just close in prayer and thank Father just for this bit of history lesson and what we've learned here. Father, I thank you that even in this dispersion, and it seems as though all has gone wrong, this nation you wanted to build is now cast off. Lo Ruhama, Lo Amin, not my people, taken to the far-flung regions of Assyria, where fathers Hosea said they'd eat unclean food, they would lose the Shabbat and the feasts, and they would consider the Torah something alien, strange. And yet, in all this, Father, there is a hope of Jezreel. Jezreel means to scatter, but it also means to sow. And unless a grain of wheat falls to the ground and dies, how will it bear much fruit? And so for this grand vision of Israel, Father, may we lift up our eyes and see it as much greater than we anticipate. That Father, it is more than the 6 million Jewish people today. That you have blessed Jacob and his seed. And the reason, Father, is that we know this because you prophesied it, Father. And even though we wrestle with the prophecies, we believe it to be true. That out of Israel was to come a nation and a company of nations. And so, Father, as we track the story, I pray you would give us eyes to understand your plan of redemption for the nations of the world, why Messiah Yeshua had to come, and this wonderful commonwealth of Israel, as Paul speaks about in Ephesians 2, that there has been a going out into all nations to belong to the story of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And there's a calling for us to come back to this people and this covenant. And so I pray that, Father, for those that have given up the time and are doing the study, that they'd have eyes to see, ears to understand more and more your ways. I pray this in the name of your Son, Yeshua HaMashiach. Amen. Amen. Okay, guys.